Well, at last we get to the Gospel of Matthew here, but I can't jump into this new material. I need some closure, okay? This is not a review. Do not panic, Sharon, okay? I don't want anyone to think I'm going back and telling you everything that we did. But here's what I want you to understand. Here's how we got here. This is what we looked at. Do you know we spent 14 classes going through this introduction to the Gospels so far. So think about all that you've suffered through. I mean, all that you've learned, all that we've done. You've been very patient because I know this material, from the feedback I was getting, it's of great interest to some people. It's very tedious and doesn't seem very relevant to others. It's the first time I taught through it, as I mentioned a couple of times already. If I could go back and restructure it and teach it again, I would tighten it up. There's some things I would leave out, some things I would include. There's ways I would do it differently. So this was a learning process for me too, but this is the first time I presented this material. What we looked at is the importance of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The importance of this literature, these books that we call the Gospels and the four evangelists. We examined the kind of literature that they are, the genre. And the reason I just included this one little point is it's one we want to keep emphasizing right here. Is right at the beginning we stressed that what the Gospels are, they are historical narrative motivated by theological concerns. So they're stories, but they're giving us historical accounts of what really happened in order to tell us something about God that we need to know. That's the theological concern. So we address that. I'm just reminding you of that. That's a good way to remember. I got that from Strauss, by the way, from his book, Four Portraits, One Jesus. I've mentioned that book to you before. I think that's an excellent way to say what the Gospels are. And then we looked at the question of why are there four Gospels instead of just one? And why only four? When there are other Gospel accounts that are non-canonical, that are not incorporated into our Bibles. So we examined those questions and we talked a lot about how to read the Gospels, vertical versus horizontal and harmonization, all of that. And then we looked at, under the broad heading of biblical criticism, the composition of the Gospels. How did they get written? And why are they the way they are? So we stressed they're the verbally inspired, inerrant, authoritative Word of God, but still God used men to write these books. They used sources. They adapted their sources. They shaped them. There was some liberty. They weren't just being dictated to God and God saying, here, Matthew, write this down, and he just stops and listens to God and just writes it down. There was research. There was shaping of the material into to give a certain emphasis, to give us a certain picture of Jesus. So we talked about that in the whole transmission of the inspiration and the recording of the Gospels and then the preserving of the Gospels and the synoptic problem. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, their similarities and yet their differences. I stress that I think the solution to that issue is Markan priority, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark, but also another source called Q. So that was, we spent a lot of time on that. But then we looked at a literary analysis, some keys to understanding the literature of the Gospels, and we'll see a little bit more of that. Now we're going to see how these things all come to apply as we begin to look at the different Gospels themselves. Then, under this area of textual criticism, we talked about some of the problems we face and the differences we have in our translations, the principles we use to address them, to determine what should the text of our Gospels be, how should they read, should you have the long ending of Mark, should that be in there, or should Mark end at verse 8, or does it go to the end of what you probably have in your Bibles down to verse 20? I believe it is. So we gave some examples of that, and I hope that was eye-opening and helpful to you. And then finally some guidelines for interpreting the Gospels that we hope will be useful. Mary, would you mind killing the front two lights here for a minute? All right, that's what we did for 14 classes. All right, now finally, an overview of Matthew. We're not going to go into actually studying the text, but let me explain what we're trying to do here. I have another slide so you understand what the whole point of this is. As I said, we're not going to study through Matthew verse by verse. We're going to do that with Mark. And normally I would do Mark first, since I think Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark. I would start with Mark and then go to Matthew and then Luke and John. But because we're actually going to study Mark, I'm going to go ahead and do Matthew first and then Luke and John, and then we'll come back and do an introduction and overview of Mark so that we can go into the text of Mark then. That seems to make sense to me since we're going to study that gospel. And another time, Lord willing, we can study the other gospels. And since it might be a while, maybe I should preach through like on Sunday night. I don't know if you'd be interested in that. I could do a series on maybe one of the other gospels since we'll be studying through Mark. Well, the point of this is I want to give you a good foundation and give you some good material. We'll talk about the handout here so that when you do study Matthew, you can go back over this. We'll have the videos. Lord willing, the material will still be available on YouTube. And I want you to be able to have this material to review if you're going to teach. Some of you, if you're going to teach the Gospel of Matthew in a class, I hope this will be helpful material to you, that you can come back. I'm going to upload. I've already uploaded the file I'm using this morning. Can you believe it? It's already there. Yeah, if you go to the link, and if you want the link, I can give that to you so you have access to the material that's on the boards. Remember, I'm taking the images out to save so that the file is smaller so that you can download it and view it on your device and not need to save it and open it in another program. So to do that, I have to delete a lot of these large images. And so that's why a lot of the text looks off-center, like there's something missing on the page. Well, I just want to make sure you get the material. So I've uploaded the files. I keep some of the pictures in there, but not all of them, all right? So I want you to be able to have all this material at your disposal, and that handout is uploaded to the website, to the Google Drive as well. You can have access to that digitally, and I'll talk about that again a little bit more in a minute. But I want you to be able to have this foundation so you'll feel that when you do go back and read and study Matthew, that you're going into it now with a new perspective, or at least maybe you've studied this kind of thing before, but if you haven't, there will be a lot of things now that you'll know and that you'll be keeping in mind that will be helpful to you, make your study of Matthew more meaningful. Or when you hear texts from the Gospel of Matthew preached, you'll be putting it into a context of what we've talked about here, and I am convinced will be more meaningful to you in that regard. So this is what I'm trying to do, is give you this information, provide you a foundation so you can teach it or so that you can further study it either on your own or we'll do that together as a church. But the reason I dim the lights is so this will show up a little bit better, and it shows up much better on the video. We've been talking about the four evangelists, as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are called, because the word gospel, that's from the same term from which we get evangelist, one who proclaims the good news. And I've presented to you when we began this study some of these images already. And you'll notice again the characters associated. We talked about this with each gospel, and I don't know why in this particular arrangement of stained glass that John is second. But normally you see here, of course, Matthew, you see the image of underneath him, the winged creatures from the cherubim, the heavenly creatures you see in Ezekiel's vision that come up in Revelation chapter 4 around the throne of God. There are these four living creatures, and one is the shape of a man, that's associated with Matthew, and because it's the face of a man and it's a winged creature, people think of an angel, even though the Bible doesn't tell us angels necessarily have wings, right? But that's what people think of. You'll see that here in the images I'm about to show you. And Mark is associated with the lion, Luke with the ox, John with the eagle, and all of that. So there's Matthew, Mark, there's Luke and John as depicted by certain artists here. But what I want to show you is if you Google Matthew the Evangelist or just Matthew and do an image search, you'll see a lot of this Renaissance era artwork or from the 16th and 17th centuries, basically, I think some of these images are. And so what's that scene depicting, of course? What's Jesus doing there with Matthew? That's kind of a creepy picture of Jesus to me, like a lot of them are. But there's a lot to look at in these. That would be an art appreciation class. You know, it would be great to we could have a class like that. We'd have to bring someone in, or you'd have to give me about 4 years to study that. But it's interesting. There's a lot to look at in this artwork because everything has some meaning. The postures, the poses, the background. These are the call of Matthew, right? When Jesus came to him, he's working as a tax collector. Remember, he called Peter and John, he called them from their work as fishermen. But Matthew was a white-collar worker. He was a professional. He was a tax collector. So he comes and calls Matthew from a despised class. It's like the IRS, but imagine the IRS has to come to your door and come into your house and take the money from you. That's the way people looked at, these tax collectors sort of with that kind of contempt because they were so often corrupt and filled their pockets by overcharging and things like that. And now being Jewish and being a tax collector for the Romans, that would make him something of a pariah among the people. But here's Jesus calling him again once more. This is you see how popular Matthew was in the early church and in the medieval period and afterwards because of how much artwork you see like this of Jesus' call. I call this the who me image because Matthew this is from 1621. And I love this one because of the light. The way the light is coming in. You see Jesus' hand and you see the light coming in. Here's another who, me? Me reaction. Looking behind his shoulder. You mean me? This is that's my favorite one, I think. Caravaggio, am I saying that correctly? From 1600. And notice, again, you're going to see the angel with Matthew a lot. But you know why now. We talked about how the four Gospels are associated with the four creatures, and Matthew with the angel. So notice, when you look for images of Matthew, there's usually that angel there. See it? And notice in this one, now see, this is what we spent a good deal of time stressing when we talked about the composition of these Gospels. It appears in this image on the left, doesn't it, that the angel is just showing Matthew, here, write this down. And we're saying that's not how the Gospels were recorded. You cannot account for the distinctiveness of the records in the way they've adapted material to think that, well, the angel just showed him exactly what to write and he wrote it down. Now, that's a simplistic view, I'm saying, of inspiration, but it's a view that I had at first when I was a new Christian. I didn't really give it much thought, and I think it's a view that a lot of people have, that Matthew's just writing down whatever the angel tells him to say. Another very dramatic depiction, powerful, incredible artwork. But there, once more, there's our angel. Notice the angel peeking in on these images as well. In fact, the one on the left from Franz Hals in 1625 inspired the image on the right That's a Rembrandt from about 1661. So notice he saw the way Matthew had been depicted earlier, but this one with the creepy angel whispering in his ear. Remember, that's not how inspiration worked. Like, okay, like you're just listening to God like you're just taking dictation. That does not explain, that cannot adequately account for the nature of these Gospels. Now, these have watermarks on them. But notice Matthew has an axe. And does anyone know why he's sometimes depicted holding an axe? For example, here's a statue of him, and when you see statuary or classic images of Matthew and you see him holding an axe, it's because of the church tradition that Matthew was beheaded. His head was cut off with an axe in Ethiopia, and so it's thought that that's the way that he was martyred, and so that's why you'll see those kinds of images here. And I love this dramatic statue, very powerful. That's at the Lateran, and that's the Lateran. That's the Basilica of St. John the Baptist in Rome. That is the quote. That's the what's the term? That's the official. Next to it is the Palace of the Popes, where the popes lived for 1,000 years. And that's the earliest cathedral in Christendom. That's the earliest basilica. And it's the official basilica of the popes. I know you think of St. Peter's in Rome, but that's the Rusconi, if I'm saying that correctly, from the 17th century, that statue. This is incredible stuff. See how the Bible story has inspired some of the most powerful and beautiful works of art, including music, in the history of the world, right? And Matthew has done that for people as well because of the importance of. Thank you, Mary. Now I'm going to switch files because I couldn't upload all of that. Those files, that would have made the file too large. So let me pull up now all the stuff we're going to be looking at. This file is uploaded that I'm about to open here. This is the 10th one, and if you've gone to the site, you notice 7 and 8 are missing. I've still got to do a lot of editing on those that I haven't had time to do because I've been getting ready for this. So I will have all those up eventually. But number 9 is there, and now, all right. I mentioned the purpose of the class, what we're trying to accomplish with this. Let's look, first of all, this is what we always do when we study a book of the Bible. We think first about when it was written, why it was written, to whom it was written, all of those things, who wrote it. These are the basic questions you start with, right? Okay, but we're going to look through this and eventually get to the theology of Matthew, and that's what we really want to emphasize, what he tells us about Jesus. But a lot of this historical context, a lot of this historical setting material does relate to Matthew's theology. So I think this can be very exciting, even though you think, oh, okay, well, the date it was written, who cares? Did Matthew really write it? Well, do I really have to know? Well, just hang with me, bros. And we're gonna you're gonna, I think, see this will be very helpful to us to start with these basic issues. So the importance of this work, first of all, the popularity of Matthew in church history. We've mentioned already, I think I asked you in that survey, did I ask you what your favorite gospel was, right? Do you remember that? Did anybody put Matthew? Isn't that interesting? Because in the early church, Matthew was the favorite, and I think for centuries. What do you think is the gospel? I already covered this with you. What's the gospel that for most people is a favorite? Do you need to air on? Do we need the AC on? It wouldn't hurt. Mike Holt, elder closest to the thermostat. I knew it had a name, that little square thing in the back. The thermostat, Mike's going to adjust it just enough to move the air around. God bless you. You're doing the Lord's work, my friend. It's a very full class. Wow. I mean, almost every seat is full. this is tremendous. This is great. All right. Well, Matthew, John's the one you'll see people hand out little copies of just the Gospel of John. I don't think anybody's doing that with Matthew. But people often loved, I think John's my favorite, but John can only be my favorite if the other Gospels exist and if I know about them, because then John stands out from them in a dramatic way in the profundity of his theology. But it's hard. It's like picking your favorite child, right? Okay, right? And especially if you do that with all of your children present, just let them know which one's your favorite kid. That always works out well. If you're going to do that after your kids are grown, do it privately and make sure the daughter you tell is your favorite. Does not tell the other children that you told them, you're my favorite. Really, you should just say it separately to each of your kids, right? And tell them not to tell the other kids. Well, when you look at collections of the Gospels going all the way back to the earliest time that we find the Gospels grouped together in a canon, in a scriptural collection, Matthew's always first. Matthew is always first. He's consistently first. Even though the other Gospels sometimes appear in a different order, Matthew's always first. Matthew was very important, a favorite of the early church. It's foundational because here is Christianity, if you will. Here is the religion of Christ emerging from Judaism. And Matthew's the Jewish gospel that sort of addresses that. And Matthew's the gospel that has the teaching of Christ so much about the law and gives the foundational charter for his new kingdom, the Sermon on the Mountain. That's the way most people look at that. So it's been extremely influential in church history and in culture. Can you think of, and that's because of course, it includes the Sermon on the Mountain. Now, can you think from some sayings from the Sermon on the Mountain or some things from Matthew's Gospel that everybody knows? Sayings that they may not know that they're from the Bible, or may not know they're from Matthew, but they are. Sermon on the Mountain, when people think of, you should turn the other cheek. Well, see, that's the one. John 3:16 was the verse people knew the best from the Bible. Now it's judge not, that you be not judged. That's Matthew 7 and verse 1. Beatitudes. Yeah, the Beatitudes. And what about, when people say, that person, they're just salt of the earth people. Sermon on the Mountain, right? I've listed a few here. Isn't that cool? I spent a lot of time making these slides. You better enjoy this. You're going to enjoy this, people. Take it in. Be impressed. All right, so things like, watch out for them. They're wolves in sheep's clothing, or he's a wolf in sheep's clothing. The Lord's Prayer, the version of the Lord's Prayer, even though Luke has a version of it, the version of the Lord's Prayer that everybody knows, that rings true. If you're writing all this stuff down, Pam, it's at the link, it's on the site, but go ahead and write it down if you want. But it's up there. But I took that image off so it looks weird. It's just like this, So, but the Lord's Prayer, judge not that you be not judged. We could go on and on. There's things in Matthew's Gospel that are show how influential it's been in shaping culture as well. Now, this quote really struck me. It really threw me when I read this. But J.E. Renan was a biblical scholar in the 19th century, and he actually called the Gospel of Matthew the most important book ever written. Can you imagine that? Why more important than John? Or if Mark was written first, why not Mark? Mark's brief, you remember? Now Matthew's got huge blocks of Jesus teaching that we don't have in Mark. And so, because it was early and because of the teaching of Christ that it contained and other factors, it shaped really this emerging Christian movement and the ethics and the teaching of the early church. So you think of it in those perspectives, that makes sense. That makes sense, right? Well, now let's look at some other issues here. This, again, is under the heading of you think of who wrote the book, when was it written, From where was it written? To whom was it written? Why was it written? Let's look at all these issues. First of all, who wrote it? The author. Well, the book doesn't say who wrote it. If we look at church history, though, we go back to the early church fathers, we find that generally they attributed it to Matthew, to the Matthew who's identified in the gospel as the tax collector who became a disciple of Christ and became one of the 12 apostles, right? So he's an eyewitness to Jesus and his ministry if this is the Matthew. Now, notice he's not called Matthew. In the accounts, in the parallel accounts, he's referred to as Levi in Mark and in the listing of the disciples in Luke. You see, there's some question whether Levi, some scholars, want to suggest that maybe this is a different disciple, or there's some dispute over whether Matthew is the one who really wrote the gospel, who was the one that Jesus called, the tax collector that he called. There's evidence that we could weigh for and against Matthean authorship, as it's called. External, internal evidence. Well, the external evidence, we go back in history, we find the early church, like Papias, for example, tells us that this Matthew wrote a gospel. And we know that from Eusebius, very early church historian, I believe around the 5th century. He quotes back earlier to Papias, where we see this is already being attributed to Matthew, but Papias seems to get some things wrong in what he says, so that's a question whether or not that's accurate. So a lot of modern scholars will say that doesn't settle the question. When you look at the internal evidence, if he's this tax collector that Jesus calls, identified as Matthew, well, there's a lot of tax collecting sort of themes that are prominent in Matthew's gospel and that are distinctive to his gospel that you don't see in the other ones. Oh, wouldn't that make sense? Just like Luke. Luke was a physician, and you have some interesting details in Luke's gospel that have to do with that sort of thing that aren't in the other gospels. Like when Jesus cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest, and then, right? What did I say? Thank you, yeah. When Peter, I said Jesus? Well, I need some more coffee. When Peter cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest and Jesus healed it, there's some things like that are distinctive to Luke and Acts. That would make sense. Plus, if he's a tax collector, well, he's an educated guy, and he would be literate and be able to record something like the Gospel of Matthew. And that's what we find when we look at the account. It shows very skillful organization of material. It's a highly structured gospel. Remember, we said Mark's the most dramatic, Luke's the most thematic, John's the most theological. Matthew's is the most structured of all the gospels. It has a very careful plan with literary cues showing material grouped together topically. Even though it follows a general chronological order, you see verbal cues that show grouping of material. We'll look at that. And so there's some questions, though. If Matthew used Mark and he was an eyewitness to Christ's ministry, why would he need Mark's gospel? But see, it's thought that Mark was relying on Peter, and sometimes the Gospel of Mark is called the Gospel of Peter in the sense that it could be Peter's account that Mark is recording, and so Matthew would have no problem relying on Peter as another apostle. So there's these arguments for and against whether Matthew wrote the gospel. I think we can say the evidence is sort of mixed, but I think we can put a lot of weight on the issue of church tradition. It seems like from church tradition, since this is very early on ascribed to Matthew, I think we can say that with some confidence that Matthew, the tax collector that Jesus called, the Apostle Matthew, wrote this gospel. But it really doesn't matter. It's anonymous. The document is anonymous. And there are a lot of books of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. Well, a lot of Old Testament books, let me say, that are anonymous in their authorship. That should not be a problem for us. But we're going to say this is Matthew's gospel. Okay? Now, when you think of Jesus calling him as the tax collector, you might think, oh, that's the passage then that would give us a clue about Matthew and who he is. But I think chapter 13 and verse 52 is the one we want to think of when we look at Matthew. When we look at the author of this gospel, whether it was Matthew or someone else, this passage, unique to Matthew, is a good one to show really what the writer of this gospel is doing. And after Jesus had taught in parables, this is in Matthew 13:52, and let me see if I can make this a little bit easier to read here. Oh, isn't that awesome? Okay. I know you're thoroughly impressed with my mad technical skills here. Well, notice, have you understood these things? Matthew 13:51, they said yes. Well, in verse 52, he said to them, therefore every scribe who is trained for the... This is kind of unusual. Who's he talking about? Every scribe who is trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasures what is new and what is old. That seems to be a really good description of Matthew, that he is, now I'm not saying Jesus is giving us some kind of cryptic description, but I'm just saying, though, that fits with Matthew, because what we find Matthew doing in his gospel is there's a lot said about the continuity of Jesus with the Old Covenant, with the old, what we call the Old Testament, but which they just called the Word of God, the Scriptures. It wasn't called the Old Testament, it was their Bible. And he shows the continuity of that, and that Jesus is the fulfillment of it, but then also, of course, showing Jesus brings a new covenant. And that is an issue that, for example, the place of the law in the life of the Christian. Are we still under the law? Are we still supposed to keep the law? Is Jesus fulfilling the law and keeping it in place? Is he abrogating it? Is it something in between those things? Matthew is the gospel that says so much about the law and the relationship of the law in the life of the Christian. Now let me just mention this as we're about to close. We still got 2 minutes. All right, all those things you think about the writer that God used. Well, when was it written? This is also a matter of dispute. Now, this is interesting to me. That's my overused saying there, right? I keep saying, hey, this is really interesting, and then I tell you something that you may dispute that, actually. Some will say it was written late, toward the end of the first century. But here's why some will say that. In Matthew 24, Jesus predicts in stunning detail the destruction of the city of Jerusalem by the Roman armies. And so they'll say, well, since it records what happened in the destruction of Jerusalem, it must have been written after AD 70 when that happened. So what's the assumption that people are making? That Jesus didn't predict, that he's not predicting the future. He must have been saying this after the fact then. And so the destruction of Jerusalem really is a key factor. And the assumptions people take to Scripture is, cannot Jesus predict what is going to happen? But then you look at references to the temple in Matthew, and it seems to be spoken of in a way, obviously in the time of Jesus, the temple was still there, but the references seem to suggest that the temple was still standing when this gospel was written. And I think it's better understood as written earlier in the 60s before the destruction of Jerusalem, but that is a very interesting factor that we take into account. Was it originally written in Hebrew or Greek? We'll look at all of that. But we've got to close for now. I'm really excited. What I want you to know about that material. Oh, this is it. Before we close, the digital version of this is uploaded to the Google Drive file that I've shared a link to it with many of you, and I'll be happy to give that to you. I spent a lot of time putting this together. I want you to hold this and clutch it to your bosom. I want you to love it and appreciate it. But if you don't want it in paper form, because the digital file's on the website, just leave it on the table, because we have a class that comes in Wednesday and we'll have some people joining us that aren't here this morning. So I will make more, though, as well. But it is available. We're going to be looking at some of the things in this material. I wanted you to have it though. Love it. Enjoy it. Benefit from it. I want it to be of use to you. Thank you for your good attention this morning. Groundhog Day. We can squeeze this in at the end of the video, right? This is what we were talking about at the beginning.
Sorry I took your chair. I am the man.
Ah, you're the man. Right. Matthew 20. Oh, just a moment. Wait, can you step out just a second? I'm videoing something right here. I'll be right with you. It's Groundhog Day. Huh?